Good morning to Mr. Vickery. Greetings
Morning.
to all from CPPR. As the world wrestles with the pandemic, CPPR is committed to bring ideas from experts from various policy domains. This webinar is a part of our online series, CPPR Live Webinar Series. I would like to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished speaker, Mr. Raymond Vickery Jr., and all present here. CPPR is an independent public policy think tank based out of Cochin since 2004. We work in the focus areas of cities and infrastructure, livelihood, health, international relations, defense, security. CPPR has within itself Center for Urban Studies, Center for Comparative Studies, Center for Strategic Studies, and its Learning and Development arm, Center for Public Policy Research Academy. This talk is hosted by CPPR Center for Strategic Studies, which deals with areas broadly encompassing international relations, India's foreign policy, defense and security. It's my great privilege and the privilege for CPPR to have with us Dr. Mr. Raymond Vickery Jr. Mr. Vickery is a leading expert on US-India relations, currently a senior associate at Center for Strategic and International Studies and a senior advisor to Albright Stonebridge Group. He was Assistant Secretary of Commerce in the Clinton administration. Mr. Vickery has served as a Global Fellow and a Public Policy Scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center and is retired partner at the international law firm Hogan Lovells. He is a founding director of a US-India Friendship Council. Mr. Vickery took a leading role in lifting nuclear sanctions against India and passage of the US-India civil nuclear legislation. Mr. Vickery is author to many books. A few of them are The Eagle and the Elephant Strategic Aspects of US-India Economic Engagement. Mr. Vickery will be speaking on US presidential elections, global political order in the midst of COVID-19. Before we start the discussion, I would like to request all the participants to mute their systems and notify us through the chat box in case you have a question. We will call out names later in the discussion. Good morning, sir, and welcome to you. Let's start with the elephant in the room, which is basically the COVID-19 that we talk about. Before jumping into the US presidential elections, we'll start with how COVID is impacting America. What is your thought on that?
Well, first of all, I want to thank the Center for Public Policy Research for having me, Dr. Dhanaraj, Gazi. It's great to be with you. I remember with great fondness when I was there in Kochi for launch of my book on India energy and participating with you. My colleague Tom Cutler and I were there, and I know the great work you do and how important it is, particularly in these times when it's easy to get distracted and to say, well, it's sort of every man and woman for himself, and we'll not really worry too much about broader public policy kinds of activities. So this is a great opportunity. I understand from Dr. Dhanaraj that, in fact, Kerala is one of the safest places in the world, and I congratulate you on that. I'm sad to say that where I am, which is suburban Virginia, right outside of Washington, D.C., conditions are not so good. You may have been following the infections. We're up to about 1.2 million at this time, and we've had some 74,000 deaths, and deaths are running at the rate of 2,500, 3,000 per day. One of the characteristics of this pandemic is the unevenness of it. And that has implications politically and for the elections as well as personal life. I'll just give you a little bit of a vignette. My son, one of my sons and his wife live usually in Brooklyn. And you may have seen in the media the overwhelming of hospitals up there, which had taken place. It's now better, thank goodness. But they, like thousands of others, fled the city, and there was a concern, of course, that when you come from an area like New York City to this area, do you bring the disease with you? And so they had to be quarantined for 14 days in our basement here at our home. And this is not an unusual situation that people have fled hotspots like New York City, like Detroit, like New Orleans. So we here in the Washington area are having some 2,000 or so deaths total at this point. And we are I suppose, emblematic of one of the basic structural differences that we have in the United States, and that is federalism and the unevenness of the way in which governments respond, and that will have implications for the election that we would talk about. So, Gazi, I hope that that's responsive. We, at this time, are still in the midst of this. There is no decline, leveling off as a whole in the nation, but we are doing our best under difficult situations.
Okay, so that is right. I mean, whenever we talk about America, the efficiency with which the Americans, they are on the front everywhere. They are on the front, fighting the diseases or any sort of assistance providing. But at this point of time, since before jumping into the elections, but the response that the Donald Trump administration is giving. So, how do you see that? Is it a response that is required, or more than that is required?
Well, the response has been uneven, and there has been a what I would call a leadership deficit at the federal level. As you know, the president, our president Trump, likes to get out and have large rallies, even in non-election times. That's one of his ways of communicating, in addition to Twitter. And that was the rallies, of course, have been impossible in view of the need for social distancing. The general principle here is that you're supposed to, in settings, remain 6 feet apart, and the other kinds of precautions that are taken. So instead of having a uniform federal approach to it, there has been a start saying that, yes, the president has all the authority to be able to respond to COVID-19 across the nation. And when it was pointed out that, in fact, our Constitution does not give the president the authority to be able to decide on shutdown measures, on orders in terms of what is an essential business and what is not. Basically, the president said, well, I've got that authority, but I'm not going to exercise it. And I turn it over to you at the states. And the governors will be in charge of that. And that's the way it has gone. Now, as you well know, we have in the United States a great variety in terms of the urbanization versus agricultural pursuits. And so the response has been very different depending upon basically urbanization and the health facilities and structure which are in the various states. This has caused tremendous problems in terms of states competing against each other and competing against the federal government for the personal protective equipment, for the swabs which are necessary for tests, for the testing materials to be able to determine whether or not antibodies are present. And that has political implications in terms of the competition and the unevenness of the response. If you're in an area which is not urban hotspot, you tend to think that, well, we really don't need these kinds of restrictions. And added to that was the initial response from the president blaming others for making too much out of this, that this was just like the flu, and we suffered a certain number of deaths from flu ordinarily, and so it wasn't that important. In fact, he used the word hoax in that regard. Well, it's pretty obvious that it's no longer a hoax, and so there have been other attempts to place blame.
Okay, we will get back to this politics. We'll get back to the how it is changing the international order, the global order, the global economy. Now we'll focus on U.S. elections. Whenever we talk about U.S. elections, why is it so important? Why do we need to discuss U.S. election in the first place? What is there that, because see, everybody talks about when there is an election in America, there is an implication on the global economy and the global politics, how the policies or the foreign policies will be taken care of, how the relations between the countries will be decided. Uh, you see, there is a stark difference between the Obama administration and the Trump administration. Uh, Previously, the focus was on multilateralism, having based on interdependence, complex, I would say complex interdependence, giving much impetus to this globalization, I would say. But we have we have witnessed a shift in that thing. America is becoming, as far as I can say, is becoming more protectionist, isolationist in an era of globalization. How do you see this?
Well, Gazi, you're absolutely right. The theme of this administration has been America first. And while all politicians are going to want to talk about their country as being first in their hearts and minds and efforts, the America first approach of this administration has been somewhat different. As you know, after World War II, the United States was the leader in setting up international organizations and institutions in order to keep the peace, to keep the economy running, and promote the health and welfare around the world. Those were three basic institutions that the United States led in regard to establishment: the United Nations, including its many agencies, what happens with the IMF and the World Bank. The United States has been the biggest contributor to that and the leader in it. And then in regard to what happened in the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and its predecessor, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade. So this was a leading position. In addition to those worldwide institutions, we were the ones who set up and basically the security architecture around the world, whether it be the North Atlantic Treaty Organization for Europe, or the many other organizations which were set up for security bases. And it is, I think, without question that in terms of defense and military apparatus, the United States has the largest. And it depends on how you measure it, but the economy on a monetary basis is the largest and certainly one of the most dynamic. Now, having said that, it is particularly important, it seems to me, to India that we be able to work together as the two greatest democracies on earth in order to be able to promote democratic ideals. The irony of this situation, of course, is that in defense of democracy at this point and under these kinds of crisis measures, the basic threat to democracy is not coming from outside our nations, but how we're able to handle as democracies our belief in terms of power comes from the people, and that all people are endowed with certain inalienable rights, and that those are protected by institutions such as the rule of law and the ability to speak and act freely. So when you have, as in the United States, an extremely divided electorate, and I can't stress how much this division has deepened and seems to be deepening by the coronavirus crisis. Things which should not be partisan in terms of things even like whether you wear a mask or not, whether or not you open up a business, whether or not you will take a vaccine, all of those are politicized in this situation. So when you have an election with such a deeply divided electorate, the election outcome will have a profound impact on policies across the board, both domestic and international. So it is important. It's important when India has an election, but it is important for the world in terms of where you are in the economic development, the security, the health and safety, as to what policy decisions are made in the United States, and that will be determined largely by the elections this fall. And I want to emphasize the wisdom of CPPR in calling this the presidential elections, because it's not just one election. We have, as you know, all of the House of Representatives up. All of the Senate is up. Many of the governors are up. And these elections together will determine the course of policy.
Okay. So, following this question, so say for example, there is this coronavirus. If a democratic president was there, did you see that there would have been a different approach of dealing with the things that are there?
Do I see a different approach? Is that the
No, in
question?
terms of if there was a democratic president, right? If there was a democratic president in place, was there a different approach that they would have taken during this crisis?
Oh, I think that there's no question there would have been. The Obama administration was very international in its approach, very willing to work with international organizations. Just give an example, in the National Security Council, there was an office which was designed to deal with pandemics, and basically that was disbanded as unnecessary. If you look at what happened with the Ebola virus, as you may recall, during the Obama administration, Ebola struck in Africa. And there was an immediate working with the World Health Organization to be able to isolate and to track infections and to be able to set up a response from the federal government. The same kind of situation existed in regard to HIV, and that was carried on in the Bush administration. It was a bipartisan activity. There was not an attempt to make it a partisan issue. And I would, this administration has taken an entirely different approach, that really this is a partisan issue, and how you deal with it is a question of whether you're making America great again, or whether or not you're leading to some hypothetical demise. And this approach, unfortunately, plays very well with about 45% or so of the American electorate. And that is the source of the division. There is an attempt here from this administration to try to blame others, to blame the World Health Organization, to blame the Democrats, to blame governors with whom the president does not agree, to blame China, and I'm sure we'll want to talk about that.
Yes, yes. China, obviously, we will definitely talk about it. So let's focus first on the US presidential election. I'm concerned, I mean, there is always a confusion whenever I talk about and whenever I read about the swing states. So the Florida, this is then there is Wisconsin is there, Michigan is there, Mississippi is there. So Alabama is there. There are few of the swing states. I don't understand what is and how the elections. I mean, why are they called swing states in the first place? And second of all, we have seen time and again, we have been collecting data on the US presidential elections from 2012 and 2016. We could see the difference that once at one time it is the Republican, it has gone to the Republican side, and at the same time, in the next election, it has gone to the Democratic side. What are the main issues that these swing states that are important for them, and why is that? It matters a lot. Is this that the electorate is more electoral college, I would say, is more in the swing states, or what is it? What is the basic reason behind that?
Well, it's a great question, Gazi, and I appreciate it. As you know, and you've referenced, we do not have a purely democratic way of electing a president in the United States. We have this electoral college, which is a really compromise in order to be able to bring states into the Union originally when it was formed. And consequently, states are the important delineation of a constituency in the presidential. As you know, President Trump is a minority president in terms of the total popular vote.
Yes.
President George W. Bush was a minority president. But that doesn't make any difference because we have this winner take all system, and you get all of the electoral votes in the state, which is the two senators, which automatically gives a disproportionate representation in the electoral college to small states, plus the numbers of members of the House of Representatives. Now, these swing states, which are also called battleground states in the United States, are the ones that you have indicated. Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Florida, Wisconsin, and North Carolina are added to those. Now, what are the issues there? And the primary issue among the majority of those states has been jobs and what has happened to the manufacturing base and employment in manufacturing in those states. And the Trump campaign has seized on a view there that people who have those kinds of jobs in manufacturing, which are essentially blue collar, have been discriminated against and left behind. And they've been left behind because of international competition and outsourcing of jobs to places like India. They have said that though it's not just the international competition, it is elites, meaning educated and those in power who have disregarded the interests of a large section of the populace in those states. Now, in all of the states, of course, there is no such thing as a unitary actor. And in addition to the base of those who feel aggrieved and who want to have social issues at the front, which will be things like abortion, gun rights, whether or not Christianity is properly protected. In those states, those issues are very much exacerbated along with the employment and economic considerations. And so the Democrats had traditionally been victors in what's called the Rust Belt, running from Pennsylvania through Ohio, through Michigan to Wisconsin. And the majority in those states, by very small margins, were convinced of the truth of what it was that was being campaigned on by Trump and the Republicans. And so the total number of the electoral votes in those states went to the Republicans, and in spite of very large margins in places like California and New York, the victory was secured for President Trump in the Electoral College.
Okay, taking it a little bit forward, what about, the issues of immigration, economy, religious freedom, and, the Muslim ban, this wall, are they still relevant, or they'll get, the COVID will COVID, the main issue will be the COVID related development. Is it the COVID or the issues like immigration, economy, and the war?
Well, I'm sorry to say that the COVID crisis has accentuated and made more acute the differences on those issues. Now, to date, it is not the case that there has been a placing of responsibility on President Trump and the Republicans for the COVID-19 response. So far, the, uh, the attempt to blame others, whether it be uh, the Obama administration, the claim had been made, and in my view, falsely, that part of the problem in terms of response was that the Obama administration had not done enough. This is in the face of the fact that it was under Trump that the budgets were cut for health and human services. Um, the attempt to blame uh, particular governors for the problem. But most of all, it has played into the business of immigration, as you say, and the blaming of foreigners for problems in the United States. Now, thank goodness, in regard to U.S.-India relations, those remain strong because there is a strong bipartisan relationship, both in the Congress and in the two parties generally, for the strength of a U.S.-India relationship based upon our common interests in democracy, in the rule of law, in regard to human rights, and our histories of being former colonies and having gotten gotten freedom from that. But these other issues of the other have come to the forefront, and most importantly, in regard to China.
Okay. So in this election, do you still see that Russia is still relevant, or is the focus has shifted to China now?
Well, I think that Russia and the role which it played in 2016, that President Trump and his advocates have been very successful in diverting attention from Russia. The Attorney General Barr has taken the Mueller report and basically taken parts out of it which diverted the attention from the essential fact that in 2016 Russia interfered with the elections, and when you only had a margin as small as it was in those battleground states, it could well have determined the outcome. But what has happened in terms of Russia is a successful attempt, in my view, to divert attention from Russia to Ukraine and to the role that former Vice President Biden played there. And it has neutralized the Russia as an issue. This is all very amazing in view of the unanimity of the security services, the intelligence committees of the House and the Senate that found that there was overt interference in our elections from Russia, and the very difficult policy decisions that have to be made vis-a-vis Russia in regard to nuclear weapons, in regard to what happens in Eastern Europe, and in regard to what happens in the security architecture of the world across the board. But Russia at this point, in my view, is not going to be a great issue. As you know, the Democrats didn't even have the courage to include Russia in the impeachment articles and didn't have the courage to put in obstruction of justice. So basically, Trump and his advocates have been successful in diverting attention away from there.
Okay, so then if we talk about China then, so as America is all guns out and the American administration, all the State Department, everyone is blaming China for this COVID-19. Can it be, can Prime Minister, the President Donald Trump, can he make this as a pretext of his election campaign, blaming everything on China and saying that I am not able to, do anything about it because it's something coming from outside, and how much will it help him to if he is getting re-elected?
Well, I think unfortunately it's going to be effective. And the reality is, of course, that China has been remiss in various ways. It did silence the doctor who originally identified the COVID virus in Wuhan, who later died for his efforts. And those efforts are ongoing by China. And if you look at the Chinese record in terms of the taking of intellectual property, the non-transparency, the repression of democracy in Hong Kong, the attempts to exclude Taiwan. It's had a great record in regard to meeting the COVID virus crisis. There are facts there, and what the reality is that you can't blame the inadequacy of your own response, of the Trump response, on faults which China had. That is a non sequitur, but it is it has been effective with the Trump base, which, as I say, is about 45% and very solid. And to say that none of this was really my fault, it's all the Chinese. And you probably saw yesterday, Secretary Pompeo is continuing to press that at a time when we ought to be pulling together. We ought to be reforming and strengthening international organizations so we get the full flow of information and we can have the best analysis possible. The United States is backing away from political reasons, for political reasons, and it will be impossible for former Vice President Biden and the Democrats to effectively counter this with a positive message about relations with China. That's just not going to work because of the way in which the argument has been framed. Unfortunately, we have a long history in this country of fear of China. When I was a young man, there was talk about the yellow peril and the hegemon. And so rather than taking a realistic view, and there are problems obviously with what China is doing in the South China Sea, in support for Pakistan, and in so many areas. But instead of taking a look at it realistically, this attempt to blame foreigners and others has now centered upon China.
Okay. Bill, I have one last question, then we'll open floor for the questions. So you see, we see that there was tension between US and China, there was trade war going on. And now the COVID is there, COVID coronavirus is there. How do you see US China tension pre and post corona? Will there be a change? How do you see it?
Well, I think obviously there is going to be a change. A lot, though, will depend upon this election. And it goes back to the point that we were making earlier. When you have such a divide on policy issues, what happens in November will have a profound effect on whether or not you try to find ways in which you can preserve peace and prosperity and deal with China, or whether or not you paint them as the progenitor of all that's bad in regard to the coronavirus. But there's no question that the fact that this crisis originated in Wuhan, a fact that there was early Chinese cover up, the fact that there is still an attempt in the Chinese area to blame others. In fact, there was circulating a completely false story that the virus might have been brought to Wuhan by American troops who were there for games which were being played, athletic events. All of those things will not be swept under the rug, and you will see an impact in what happens with Huawei and 5G, and you're going to see a pullback. The reality is, though, that these two economies are very much integrated, that a large part of the United States debt is held by China. And so it's not going to be possible just to have a situation in which you cut off yourself and you have the Pacific Ocean as a great moat between the United States and China.
So we have few questions that people have asked. We have so many participants that are there on this webinar. They have participated, and they have so many questions also. Uh, so there's a question from there's a comment. A senior fellow of CPPR, Mr. Murli Nair. So he's saying, on the one hand, it is widely believed that the Chinese would go to any extent, including repeating the Russia, to see Donald Trump does not return to power in 2020. On the other hand, Chinese wish him back to achieve a long-term goal as Donald Trump 2.0, if he is getting re-elected, will further destroy America's strength and its influence and the leadership globally. This way, the Chinese would also be able to tell their citizens, particularly those seeking democratic reforms, that their way of communism is best suited for the Chinese nation. It's not the whole world, but for the Chinese nation, communism is best. So, any comments, sir, on this?
Yes, I think that this question, which is a very good one, highlights the need for these two greatest democracies on the face of the earth, India and the United States, to be able to work together to meet the Chinese challenge. The reality is that China sees itself as an expansive power, whether it be the 9 dot line in the South China Sea, whether it be what is happening has happened in Sri Lanka in terms of getting port facilities there, whether it be what is happening in the so-called string of pearls, which includes Pakistan port, in order to be able to have a dominance which runs in a Belt and Road initiative from China through the Indian Ocean to Africa and beyond. So it's no question in my mind that India and the United States need to work positively to meet this challenge. And unless we can, the democratic approach, small d, democratic approach to being able to meet crises like COVID-19 will not win the day. And the authoritarians, whether they be China, whether they be North Korea, whether they be Russia, will say, look, this is the way in which you have to act. You have to have an authoritarian system in order to be able to keep people safe. So I think that this COVID crisis is an extremely important challenge to the two greatest democracies in the world. And I believe that regardless of what the outcome is in November in the US election, it behooves India to try to take a greater role in terms of democratic leadership and the importance internationally of our approach as opposed to the Chinese authoritarian approach.
Uh, and we have another question by Mr. Abraham, sir. He is Academic Director, Center for Public Policy Research. Sir, he's asking, will the public health be the main issue for the presidential election since we are seeing economy is not doing well and there are so many, casualties, highest in the world. So how do you see, if so, would Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren be a better candidate for Democrats to take on Trump?
Is the question whether Elizabeth Warren will be the candidate to take on Trump? I mean, at this point, we have a presumptive nominee in Joe Biden. He swept. And the question now, of course, is in the vice presidency. And Vice President Biden has pledged to have a woman as a vice president. And so it may very well be that Elizabeth Warren would bring great strengths to that ticket. It's no question that within the Democratic Party, Joe Biden represents a more moderate approach, and there are very strong elements who want to see a more liberal, a greater safety net, whether it be in health and whether or not it be in education, whether it be in terms of guaranteed income. And Elizabeth Warren could certainly speak to that element of the Democratic Party. And in regard to how this works out in November, turnout is going to be all important. I doubt very seriously that all the electoral activity is going to shift the views of many Americans between Trump and Biden. But what will be important is the turnout as to whether or not the base of Trump will feel strongly enough to turn out in the numbers which gave him the victory in those battleground states in 2016, or whether or not those who support the Democratic side, including particularly educated women or women with higher education, which are symbolized by Elizabeth Warren, whether they will turn out. As you know, one of the reasons that we have a Democratic majority in the House of Representatives now is because of women turning out and voting. In my own state in Virginia, we had 3 swing jurisdictions that went from Republican to Democratic, all won by women. and that is very important. And of course, that's the reason that that there will be attacks from the Republicans have already started on Joe Biden's record in regard to women and the very sensational kinds of allegations which have been made against him. And even though President Trump may not participate because of his own background in regard to his treatment of women, you can bet that the attempt will be on the Republicans to split off that element of the Democratic coalition.
Okay, thank you. So before we move further, I want to make an announcement. If any one of you, the participant, have any questions, please type in the chat box, and we can take questions from there. Thank you. Now moving forward, we have a question from Jay Kishan and Nair. He's asking, if Joe Biden gets elected as president next time, can it affect the current the strategic relation between India and USA? If a Democratic nominee or a candidate is becoming president, how is it going to affect the strategic relationship between India and USA?
Well, I think that the relationship between the United States and India, thank goodness, is very bipartisan and very strong. Vice President Biden has many Indian American supporters, particularly. My good friend Swadesh Chatterjee has been very much a leader in that. And I think that there's no question that that the relationship will be strong, regardless of which candidate is elected. Having said that, I do think that there are downsides in the U.S.-India relationship if regardless of which candidate is elected. On the Trump side, it is in regard to H-1B visas and the whole business of trying to blame foreigners for taking American jobs. And that was a staple in the last election, and the whole business about what happens with immigrants. As you know, they have stopped immigration basically on the basis of COVID-19. On the downside, from the perspective of the U.S.-India relationship, if Biden and the Democrats are the questions of human rights, of what is happening in terms of the lockdown in Kashmir, what happens in regard to the Citizenship Act and so forth. And I think that India sometimes underestimates, the Indian government underestimates the power of those issues, particularly in Congress. And that, in my view, is going to be there and behooves both India and the United States to be at the forefront of trying to protect democracy and human rights.
Sir, we have a question from Katya Yuni. She is one of the researchers in CPPR. The various sources have indicated of disproportionate and adverse effect of this crisis on African American communities and the indigenous communities. So how do you see the sentiments and the interests of these communities playing out in the US general elections?
Yes, I think it's a great question, and thank you very much for it. The reality is that COVID-19 has disproportionately affected African American communities and urban communities of color. And it is exacerbating the issues which were already there. As you may know, in the last couple of days, there's been another killing of an African American, unarmed, by two white men in Georgia under very egregious circumstances. With COVID-19, I believe that unfortunately, uh, the American society, instead of pulling together, is in some areas actually pulling apart. Now, there are good things that are happening, the cheering of frontline workers, and actually the willingness of people to do what I'm doing here and staying at home, and distancing and so forth, shows that there is a countervailing current as well in terms of the effect of COVID-19. But I am afraid, in regard to the issues of race, issues of religion, in regard to ethnic backgrounds, that instead of the COVID-19 crisis being an occasion to pull people closer together and work together, that the Trump approach is to divide and conquer, and that is going to be exacerbated by this crisis and by the unevenness of the way it hits the people who have been disadvantaged, regardless of color, in access to health care, in support from social institutions across the board.
Thank you, sir. We have another question from Vice Admiral Muzbidaran. Uh, Sir is asking that economists talk about Washington more like Brussels, with states gaining dominance, right? And normally, when there is a national calamity, people unite and presidents and PM gets better ratings. The Economist survey talks of drop in Trump's losing ratings. So, how do you see it?
How do I see whether or not it's pulling together in terms of the economy? Uh, I I think that the divisions there are being exacerbated as well. You know, one of the things that has been politicized is the willingness to open up the economy and to return to business as usual. And while there have been bright spots, such as the Republican governor of Maryland, Larry Hogan, who has taken an approach to save lives, there is generally now considered to be a Republican and Trump talking point that we're going too far in trying to do that. And what we have to do is concentrate on getting people out of lockdown and out in their jobs. Of course, nobody wants the economy to be shut down. Nobody wants that. The question is how you do it. And the question is whether or not you can test people. And then for those who are not testing positive, get them back to work with distancing, masks, and so forth. Everybody should want to. But the problem is that there is a growing rage, if you will, in terms of people being frustrated. And you may have seen the reports of invasion, really, in the Michigan State House, where people showed up with assault rifles and went in and were in the Senate chamber in that state legislature. Now, thank God, nobody got shot or nobody did that, but it's a very dangerous kind of mix to try to pull together the questions of response to COVID-19 and the Second Amendment right to bear arms. That's a recipe for real disaster. And one would hope that cooler heads are going to prevail in that regard.
Sir, we have one question from Heta Thakkar. So she's asking the Nobel The novel backlash, particularly in Germany, Britain, France, against China is on the rise due to its initial cover-up of the outbreak. So, how do you see Trump capitalizing on this opportunity with European allies with regards to economic decoupling, diversification of supply chains, and entry of Huawei?
Well, if it were the case that the Trump administration was acting in what I would consider to be a positive way, that this would be an occasion for cementing relationships in terms of Europe and having a common concern about China and what goes forward. Unfortunately, the Trump administration approach is still to use the sledgehammer approach that has worked for President Trump in the United States, namely dividing Europeans into good Europeans from an American perspective to bad Europeans, ones that are not agreeing with all of the policy. So, you know, you just take in terms of Germany, the threats against importation of German automobiles completely undercuts the ability to work against a common concern or in regard to a common concern with China. So yeah, it should work that way. It should work in favor of India in terms of being able to have more of a supply chain and a make in India coming from India to the United States. However, it's unclear whether or not the Trump administration will really move forward in view of the fact that H-1B visas, the movement of people, the movement of services across international lines are absolutely fundamental to that relationship. So I do think that having a more constructive approach to our friends, to United States friends, and taking into account, yes, you can have differences on various policy issues and still work to contain, if you will, authoritarian tendencies around the world. Unfortunately, we haven't gotten to that point.
Okay. So we'll take three more questions. One question is from Nitin Ramakrishnan. He is CPPR Research Fellow. So he's asking, Joe Biden cannot make pro-China position or even speak about China little neutrally. Will Biden speak positive message about the international organization? What will be the people's reaction to it?
Well, that again is a very good question, and it goes back to the original point that I was trying to make about international institutions and the difference between uh, Trump and Biden in terms of their approach. There's no question that given the division which has been sowed and the concern about foreigners and people who are not like the Trump base, that it becomes very difficult for an internationalist like Joe Biden to be able to do anything but say, me too, on opposition to China. One would hope that that there will be instances and constituencies for a broader approach. And basically, it seems to me that approach has to start with countries like India, where you can make a very solid case to Americans that will be listened to that there is a lot to be gained economically and in terms of strategic relationships between the United States and a foreign power, India. And if you can do that, it seems to me, then you blunt the necessity for trying to demonize China. And that, I think, will be the approach. And it's a valid one, and it will apply not only in regard to India, but back again to Europe and the previous question we had. I mean, the reality is that the United States and India, the United States and democratic powers in Europe, in the Quad with Japan, Australia, China, and the United States, all these democracies have a great deal in common. And so if you can talk about how you can do things positively, I think that that will resonate. You know, the 96% of the consumers in the world are outside the United States. There is no way in the final analysis that you're going to have the level of prosperity which will reach down and sustain the average person in the United States without participating in the global economy and in global security arrangements. That's just reality. And if you're talking about looking to the future, which I think is what Joe Biden has to do, he has to focus not just on where we are with this particular virus and these particular challenges, but what are we going to do in the United States with our allies and our friends such as India to meet the crises of tomorrow, because those crises are coming. They will be in regard to climate change. The fact is that the fires and floods are going to present great crises, and those have to be met together. We have not gotten out from under the shadow of nuclear war, and it could be, even by mistake, something would happen there which would make the whole COVID crisis look like a walk in the park. So it seems to me that what Joe Biden has to do is he's not going to be able to just say great things about China or even things which are reasonably moderate. But what you can do is make the case to the American people that we have to work together for our own good, for our enlightened self-interest, if we're going to prosper in the 21st century.
Okay, thank you, sir. Now let's focus the debate on the geopolitics, the global order, the world order. So how do you see with the COVID-19, how is it going to change the world order? Are we shifting, is the balance of power shifting towards the Chinese favor, or still it's in the American favor? And how do you see these things playing out role, as you mentioned, Quad, playing role in the Indo-Pacific region as well?
Well, the way I see it is that this COVID-19 crisis has not redounded to the benefit of either the United States or China. We have both been very remiss and inadequate in terms of our response. And so I think rather than just seeing it, well, does it benefit the US? Does it benefit China? The question is really which country is going to show that it is able to recover from this and have a future which benefits the Aam Admi, the average person in our country. And there's no question it's going to have an effect on the world order. But my view is it's going to be not moving just to the United States or moving to China. Unfortunately, what's going to happen is that that nations across the world are going to, instead of looking at their longer term interests, draw inward and say, look, we can do the same thing and build our prosperity within our own borders. And we don't need to work together in order to prevent a war. But we don't need to be able to work together in order to prevent freedom of transit on the seas. That the forces of nationalism will be stronger across the board. And I fear that in regard to India as well. That's the reason, though, it's extremely important to have somebody in office in the United States who recognizes that we have to strengthen not just organizations like the World Health Organization, but we have to use the G20, which includes the emerging economies and gets away from this Euro-centric approach, which was a part of what happened after World War II. So I think that this election is extremely crucial in terms of what happens in the world order.
Okay. So, I may ask you how many questions can you take? Can we take few more questions?
I'm happy I'm here.
Okay, sir. So we have a question from Aishwarya. She's one of the researchers here. She's asking, what are the chances that the Trump administration's policy of blaming China and other countries for its own faults can backfire during these elections, given a significant immigration population in America, including the Asian Americans and the other minorities?
Well, again, that's a very good question. I think that in terms of backfiring, uh, it, it can backfire, but it's unlikely to do so because uh, Asian Americans are very much um, separated in terms of national origin as well. And so the, there's not a such thing as Asian American solidarity across the board between Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Indian Americans, and so forth. The Democratic Party has tried to build that and will continue to try to do that. But so far, that is not the prism through which this is viewed. I do think that the more likely way in which this backfires is that the unfolding of information about COVID-19, its origin, about the ability to get vaccine development, takes a turn which shows that really you need to be able to figure out how to work with China, and that it wasn't China that caused the kinds of damage which we're seeing now. As you know, some of the modeling shows that deaths, which are now around 74,000, will be about twice that before it calms down. And if there is a second wave in the fall, then it seems to me that the arguments that China is the heart of all of our COVID-19 problems gets very much weakened, because we have had, or this administration is having its turn at bat. And if it continues to get worse, the arguments that it's just China, in my view, will become less effective politically.
Okay, sir. We have one question related to again the ideological debate between the states, the red and the blue state, the Democratic and the this Republican state. So, is this the divide that is between these two states? Is it an ideological in nature? Abhirami is the one who is asking questions. He's one of the researchers in CPPR. So, do you see that there is an ideological divide between the red states and the blue states? And can we say that it's only the ideological differences that causes the separation and change in the colors, and sometimes even the shift between the swing states?
Yeah, I'm afraid that it is true that the divide between red and blue states is deepening. And that's the reason you have so few battleground states. When you think you got 50 states here, and we've named off 5 or 6 battleground states: Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Florida, North Carolina. Um, that's really just a handful of states out of the 50 states. And so what does that mean? That means that the rest are pretty solidly red or pretty solidly blue. And those which are red and Republican are in that 45%, but as we said earlier, are going to have a disproportionate effect in terms of the election of the president because of the electoral college which we have. And so I think that that the kinds of issues we've talked about, the social issues of race, religion, abortion, will have a great effect in the red states. I noticed that the person who leads the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the largest Protestant denomination in the U.S., who was against Trump last time, said he's going to come out and be for Trump. And the reason is because he wants to be able to control the Supreme Court direction. And that is extremely effective with the red states. They've been in the forefront of understanding that when you have control of the presidency, you get to appoint the Supreme Court with the approval of the United States Senate. And if you can do that, then your agenda in terms of religion, social issues, guns, and so forth can be affected not just for now, but for many decades to come. So I'm afraid this division is with us.
Okay, thank you, sir. I have one last question. It was raised by again Abhirami has asked this that sir, we saw some of the significant budget cuts, especially in the national health spending. So, is this going to have an impact at all, if at all, on the Trump election? Considering the fact that if certain funds are preserved, it would come in handy at a time when a time like this, but there weren't anything when required. So how do you see this? That the budget cuts in the
Yeah,
healthcare?
the budget cuts, in my view, have been subsumed really by what is happening in response to COVID-19. We have thrown so much money at the crisis, whether it be for small business relief, relief of the airlines. The amounts are in the trillions of dollars, which is astounding. So the question of budget cuts, which should have been very prominent, because it has left us in a position not to have the support that we need in our healthcare systems, in our social safety nets. Those are budgeting is kind of out the window at this point. The Republicans have abandoned the business of trying to keep deficits down. The Democrats are sure trying to make something out of, well, we got to get more money for this education program and we got to get more for this healthcare program. But people are now focused on their immediate needs. And so the whole question of reopening and getting back to work is going to be far more salient in this election, in my view, than the question of these budget cuts.
Thank you so much, sir. I think we will wind up this now. It was an amazing wonderful to listen to you, listening about the US presidential elections, various aspects of it, various issues that are detrimental to the US presidential elections, and knowing about the swing states. It was really a wonderful experience of listening to you. Thank you so much, sir. Uh, I would thank all of you being here on this part of the webinar, live webinar series. To know more about our work, do please check our website, cppr.in. CPPR is active on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. The handle that we use is CPPR India. Thank you all once again. Thank you so much.